Welcome to Critical Thinking Video 2, Critical Reading and Source Reliability. When we're engaging with work at university, it's quite often books, journal articles and reputable websites that form the basis of our reading. However, there are far more sources that we might want to engage with. There are professional journals, governmental information, organisational literature and newspaper articles. You may also find yourself using images, artwork, films, music and podcasts. No matter what source you're using, it's always important to consider the credibility of the author and of the source. There's always a series of questions that we can ask. The first is it peer reviewed? Peer review is a process where an author will submit a manuscript, and before it is accepted and published, that manuscript will be sent to other experts in the field. They will not know who the author is, and the author will also not know who has been sent their manuscript. This is called a blind peer review. Nobody knows who each other is, and they cannot influence the outcome. The reviewer will read the paper, and if they are happy with it being published, they will notify the editor and the work will be made available. They can also request amendments or refuse a paper for publication. This is why peer review is the gold standard. It means other experts in the field have checked the work before it's been made available. Journal articles are generally peer reviewed. Books, however, are not necessarily. It's a very different form of peer review, so that's something for you to be aware of. The second question we can ask ourselves is if it's cited by lots of other people. Without getting into too much detail around this, a paper that is heavily used is often seen as seminal. This means it's been widely recognised by other researchers as a useful document. We can often tell this by how many times it has been cited, and so it can be useful to check Google Scholar and other specific databases for this information. Another question that's worth considering is what websites are okay. Some sources will say websites should never be used, but actually they can be really useful when they're the official source of information. This can include things like NHS websites, governmental websites or company websites, where that is essentially where the information is published. Quite often it may not even be available in paper anymore. While websites are okay where they're an official or reputable source of information, we also need to consider that some websites are not. Wikipedia, for example, is not an authoritative source. It's a useful place to browse for ideas, but is never something that we should cite. The final question we can consider is who is the intended audience? Is the thing that you're using written for academics, professionals, the public, or a certain socio-economic or demographic? This is a really important thing for us to consider. For example, if you're writing a really important essay about a medical condition in your final year of university, you probably don't want to be using information from the NHS Choices website. This is a source of information that anyone in the public can use. It's written for people to help them care for themselves. It's not the kind of source we would hope a medical professional would use. However, this is always bound in context. So while you might not use NHS Choices in a standard essay, if your question was focused on how people self-help, NHS Choices would be a really good source. It's a great example of the information made available to the public, and so you would be able to look at it and bring that into your essay critically. It's not just the credibility of the source we need to consider, but also that of the author. What is their affiliation? Do they work for a university, the press, a political party, or are they employed in a way that might bias their writing? What is their expertise? Are they a trained academic, practitioner, researcher, or member of the public? And finally, based on this affiliation and expertise, is there any bias you might be able to identify, either historical, economical, political, or geographical? While these are questions we might not need to consider in too much detail for journal articles, they're definitely something we want to consider for all other sources of information. Whenever we're picking up a source, we can use the CRAP test to help see if it's useful. Currency helps us see when the source was written, or at least when it was last updated. This is really important in some fields such as medicine and nursing, because the research rapidly develops. You're caring for other people and should be using the very latest sources. Relevance lets us think who the audience is for and if it links to the topic. Authority helps us see who wrote the source and who published it. Accuracy asks us to question whether or not it uses appropriate evidence. And purpose lets us see the source and consider why it was written and if that purpose might bring any bias. So let's look at some different source types in detail. For books, they're a great overview of the topic area, a great place to see theories, histories and definitions. However, they are quite limited in some other regards. They get out of date quickly. Even a book that was published this year may have taken 2 or 3 years to write and go through the publishing cycle. This is very different to a journal, which can be turned around much quicker. Books are rarely peer-reviewed, and it's also important to consider that they are created to make money. That is their main goal. It's for people to buy them and for publishers and authors to make money. Turning to academic journals and periodicals, they are the most reliable source of current thinking in the vast majority of fields. They are published regularly, and to be one of the most reliable sources, they need to be a peer-reviewed journal, and most are. Similarly, professional journals and magazines are also very useful. They do also have some strengths and weaknesses. So, for their strengths, they do uphold the standards of the profession, and they do check on the credibility and authenticity of the information presented. However, they do tend to work within a particular way of thinking that's unique to that professional. And so this does mean that they can sometimes have a slight bias as to what is generally acceptable in that profession. You may also use governmental information. The gov.uk site is a really good example of this in the United Kingdom. It is, however, really important to bear in mind that gov.uk is not an author. It is a collection of different organisations, ministerial departments and governmental quangos that all host their information in one place online. The screenshot to the far right gives an example of the Public Health England website. As such, anything I was taking from this page I would attribute to the Public Health England and not to gov.uk. Like any of the other sources, governmental information does have strengths and weaknesses. It's a good source of information, particularly the official line from the government. In health, this is really important because your profession is very bound to these regulations. Governmental sources of information are generally gathered rigorously, and so they can be very reliable. And the research is often very well funded and done at a large scale. However, it can be structured to present a very particular view, especially dependent on which party is in power. And also, governments do tend to want to present a certain view of themselves, so they look like they're being effective. This isn't to say that governments do cover things up, but they may be very selective about which pieces of information they choose to reveal. Newspapers. Newspapers are a great source of evidencing public opinion, and they do offer a unique insight into what is happening or into what has happened. However, they can have very different political and social agendas and can be very biased. Each newspaper will have a slightly different leaning or social or political agenda. Generally, the broadsheets are more reliable than the tabloids. Websites. As mentioned earlier, websites are useful as the official source of information, particularly for governmental papers, company reports, NHS policies, and other similar sources. It's also very easy to access and search. However, unless you're on an official website linked to a company or an organisation, it can be very difficult to ascertain who created that page and why. This makes it difficult to see how reliable information is. Anybody can set up a website. It's very easy to do. I could do it right now and put any information on it with no reliability, no credibility, and no evidence, and yet people would still have access to see it. No matter what source you're using, the key thing is that you're using them critically, and that you are using sources appropriate for the context you're working within. When you're reading, try to identify the position that the writer has taken. Whenever you're looking at any issue, topic, policy, debate, theory, or similar, there is always a spectrum of relevant debate. As in the previous video, this isn't always just the binary positions of yes, no, positive, negative, good and bad. There's much more nuance in these different positions. Your challenge when reading is to see which authors are arguing for what. In this example, I've identified that author A and B have a very similar position, so does D and E. Author C sits somewhere in between them. This can help inform how I'll use them as evidence in my writing. I just briefly want to mention logical fallacies. There's much more information about these in video 6, but a logical fallacy is basically faulty logic, and this is something that we need to look out for when we're reading. Activity. This is a useful opportunity for you to try some of the things you've just learned, considering other people's viewpoints and sources of information. If we take something like a novel virus and a pandemic, what sources of information could there be produced about this phenomenon? Pause the video now and write down some potential sources of information that you could use. For this particular case, it's a very long list. Of course there would be information from the NHS and the government, Public Health England, the World Health Organisation and other official bodies. There'd also be information from research institutes, drug and pharmaceutical companies, universities and other researchers. Newspapers and the media would produce information interpreting the actions of governments. Through social media, citizens and influential figures would also comment and share their thoughts. This is where it starts to get problematic. As we're seeing with a website, anybody can create information and publish it online. While there are lots of sources of information, how reliable are they all? What are their biases? This is just an example of one very small thing and a huge amount of information that could be produced about it. Whenever you're undertaking an academic assessment, you need to think, what sources of information are there about what I'm working through, and also are there any potential different positions and bias within this? As you would see with a pandemic, you would probably find a government trying to demonstrate it's doing very good, and opposition politics trying to argue where the mistakes are happening. This is just an example of some of the biases you will see in this case.